Okay, so if I'm tracking, the argument goes like this. Kedar is Arabia, Muhammad is tied to Arabia, Jesus has nothing to do with Arabia, so Isaiah 42 must be about Muhammad? Look, I know this is just a short, and some Muslims are going to say that I'm leaving things out, but I've read Abraham Fulfilled, which this creator co-authored, and the argument really does hinge on the mention of Kedar, and it completely misreads Isaiah 42 at the most basic level.
Actually, if you read Abraham Fulfilled, they give a lot of arguments as to why Isaiah 42 refers to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. It does not actually all hinge on Kedar, even according to them. For example, they make an argument that the servant has to come during a time of exile, and Jesus did not come during a time of exile. So Testify is misrepresenting the book here.
And it completely misreads Isaiah 42 at the most basic level. Isaiah 42 doesn't say that the servant comes from Kedar. When Kedar shows up, Isaiah has shifted into a call for worldwide praise. The chapter calls on the coastlands, the wilderness, and the villages of Kedar and the people of Selah to lift their voices and sing a new song to the Lord. Muslims like Adnan will often attempt to link Selah to Medina, but most biblical scholars identify Selah with Edom, given its consistent use elsewhere in Scripture. Regardless, the point is that this is not a biography, but worship language and poetic parallelism. It's a geographical sweep of distant peoples joining in praise because of what God is doing.
So actually, it doesn't matter if Isaiah 42 tells you where the servant is going to come from, or if it's just talking about Gentiles in general worshiping God, because Islam fulfills it either way, right? If we take Isaiah 42 as describing the fact that God's worship will spread to all these distant lands, well, that's what happened when Islam came. And it did not happen with Christianity, because Isaiah 42, the whole point is that people will not worship the false gods anymore. But the Christianity that spread to different lands is this pagan Trinitarian version of Christianity, where God is being eaten, where a man is elevated to the status of God, where you have three gods. That doesn't fit Isaiah 42 at all, where the whole point is that people will give up their false idols and begin to worship the true God. Whereas the Christians, they worship Jesus, they worship Mary and their saints and all this. So it doesn't fit at all.
And a new song can't be pressed into, wow, look how the Quran starts with praise to God, or Muhammad brought a new law and Jesus didn't, like Adnan tries to argue in the book. But in the Psalms, new song is just stock language for praising God for fresh acts of deliverance.
So Testify has not actually refuted the Islamic case for Isaiah 42 here. Again, he's just given a different interpretation for what the new song refers to as compared with Adnan's interpretation. But regardless of which interpretation you take, both interpretations perfectly fit Islam, because even if we go with Testify's interpretation, yeah, Islam spread to the Gentile lands and God's praise spread to the Gentile lands. How is he refuting the Muslim case for Isaiah 42? He's just giving a different interpretation from Adnan, which perfectly fits the Islamic fulfillment as well.
If you really want to know what Isaiah is doing, stop isolating one part of the chapter and follow the data trail Isaiah himself gives you. In Isaiah 9, there's a promised ruler who sits on the throne of David, and his titles are extraordinary, including Mighty God. This is clearly a Davidic king with divine weight. He is the light that dawns in Galilee of the Gentiles, a passage the Gospel of Matthew explicitly applies to Jesus' ministry in Galilee. Then, in Isaiah 11, the same expectation is developed further. There's a spirit-anointed figure who arises from the root of Jesse, meaning a Davidic descendant appearing when the monarchy looks completely cut down, like it has to begin all over again. He brings justice and the nations seek him. Isaiah 11's root of Jesse is explicitly tied to Jesus in Romans 15, where Paul quotes the passage to explain the Messiah's rule over the nations. Then Isaiah 42 introduces a servant upheld by God and endowed with the Spirit who brings justice to the nations and is a covenant for the people, just like we saw him being endowed by the Spirit in Isaiah 11.
So what Testify is doing here is he's essentially saying that the servant of Isaiah 42, same one mentioned in Isaiah chapter 11, therefore it has to be a Davidic descendant. However, that is not clear at all. There are a lot of things that can be said in response. First of all, Isaiah chapter 9 and Isaiah chapter 11 are part of the first 39 chapters, which make up first Isaiah, known as Proto-Isaiah, are often actually thought to be Isaiah 1 through 33. So first Isaiah, according to modern scholars, is written by the original Isaiah, and then Isaiah 40 onwards is written by another prophet. And even Inspiring Philosophy Testifies Buddy agrees with this analysis. However, even if you don't agree with this analysis, and it is actually the original Isaiah that wrote chapters 40 onwards, it doesn't matter, because regardless, Isaiah 40 begins a completely new section of the book. So there's no need to then correlate what is said in 42 to the first part of the book, because Isaiah 40 onwards begins a completely different section. Isaiah 40 onwards is then its own new half of the book. First, Isaiah is addressing a lot of the historical reality with Assyria, and then Isaiah 40 onwards begins this whole new talk regarding Babylon and Cyrus and the exiles and these prophecies in Isaiah 42 onwards. And actually, if you read Isaiah 40 onwards, it doesn't talk about the Davidic Messiah. You don't get language about a branch from David is going to come out, the root of Jesse is going to come out. Isaiah 40 onwards is completely disinterested in this idea of a Davidic Messiah. The closest you get is a somewhat ambiguous verse in Isaiah 55, which actually many scholars interpret as changing the promise of David and saying that the promises of the Davidic Messiah are now applied to the people instead of a specific king from the line of David. And based on that, a lot of scholars actually say that second Isaiah is uninterested in this idea of a Davidic Messiah. In fact, if anything, Cyrus is depicted in Isaiah 40 onwards as fulfilling the Davidic role. So he's called a shepherd. He's the one who rebuilds the temple. He's the one who rebuilds Jerusalem. He's called Messiah, which was a title used for the Davidic kings. And what he does, restoring the Israelites from the exile, is what Jeremiah and Ezekiel describe the Davidic Messiah as doing. So if anything, Isaiah 40 onwards is actually giving the roles of the Davidic Messiah to Cyrus. Now, regarding the actual passages that he quoted, if we go to Isaiah 9, we see that actually every single verse refutes the idea that Isaiah chapter 9 is fulfilled in Jesus. The whole point of Isaiah chapter 9 is that the yoke of the foreigners is broken. The foreign oppressors of Israel, they are defeated, their power is broken, and the Israelites are freed. And the Muslims, they did this when they defeated the Romans. But of course, when Jesus came, he was rejected. And as a punishment, God again sent the foreigners, the Romans, to destroy the temple and to defeat the Israelites. So Jesus' coming is the opposite of Isaiah 9. Isaiah 9 talks about freedom from oppression, whereas when Jesus came, God punished the Israelites for rejecting him by sending the Roman armies to again oppress the Israelites. In fact, even the verse about Galilee in Isaiah chapter 9 actually proves this, because the whole point of the verse is that in the past, the Assyrians came and destroyed that land, but in the future, God is going to honor that land. So there's a clear contrast. Before, the Assyrians destroyed it, but now in the future, God is going to honor that land. When the Muslims came, they, of course, freed that land from Roman oppression. However, after Jesus came and he was rejected by the children of Israel, the Romans came and again, they destroyed the land of Galilee. So far from the contrast in Isaiah 9, when Jesus came and he was rejected, the Romans did the same thing that the Assyrians did beforehand. And regarding the names given to the child, these are just theophoric names. It is not saying that the child is God. This is an anachronistic way to read Isaiah 9. In the Israelite society, names were often given to people, but they did not describe the actual people. Rather, the names described the God of that child. This is how names sometimes functioned, not only in Israelite society, but also in the ancient Near East. Isaiah 9 fits the Muslim conquests better than it does Jesus. Now, regarding Isaiah 11, it is shocking that he's appealing to Isaiah 11, because Isaiah 11 actually refutes the idea that the Messiah is God. It says in verse 3, his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. So the Messiah is going to fear God. So how can he be God if he is fearing God? This whole idea that, oh, maybe he was talking about the human nature and all these different copes, they are very anachronistic and copish ways to read Isaiah. Isaiah never spells it out that, oh, he's actually a divine child who has multiple natures, he's a triune God and all this. You have to look at the picture that Isaiah paints. He says, the Messiah, he will delight in the fear of God. He never tells you that, oh, it's part of a trinity and all this stuff. So actually, any attempt to explain this away would not be a genuine exegesis of the text, but it would be an ad hoc reinterpretation of Isaiah to force it to be in line with later Christian theology. In fact, the same thing is in Isaiah 42, because Isaiah 42, God is speaking and he says, "Here is my slave." So the person in Isaiah 42 is God's slave. It cannot be Jesus, who Christians consider to be God. And again, the only way to get around this is to ad hocly reinterpret Isaiah and say, oh, well, it's talking about the Trinity and Jesus coming down as a slave. Again, Isaiah never says that. This is just an ad hoc attempt to force Isaiah 42 to be in line with Christianity. And by the way, just look at his standards for prophecy versus our case for Isaiah 42. If you go through his entire video, he doesn't quote anything in Isaiah 42 which refutes the Muslim case for it being the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. There's not a single verse he can give you that contradicts the fulfillment being the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. Rather, he tried to jump to different passages. But look at how weak that is as an argument against the Muslim interpretation of Isaiah 42 and compare that to his standards of prophecy. He's appealing to Isaiah 9, where the whole point is that the foreign oppressors are defeated, which is the opposite of what happened when Jesus came. So the entire chapter doesn't match Jesus, but Testify, he takes one verse about the child being born and he says, oh, this is an amazing prophecy about Jesus. Same thing in Isaiah 11. If you read the entirety of Isaiah 11, it talks about the Messianic period. It talks about this amazing peace that is spread across the world. It talks about the Israelites returning to the land. 90% of Isaiah 11 has not been fulfilled by Jesus, yet Testify accepts it and says, oh, it's such an amazing fulfilled prophecy. Yet he will reject Isaiah 42, even though there's not a single detail in Isaiah 42 which contradicts the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam's fulfillment, and he himself essentially admits it because he doesn't point to a single verse which goes against the fulfillment of it being the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. And this is not to say that Isaiah 11 isn't about Jesus' second coming, but it's simply to highlight that 90% of what's said there was not fulfilled by Jesus, yet he says, wow, this is an amazing prophecy of Jesus, yet Isaiah 42 everything fits, and he rejects that. So just look at the standards that he's using. So the idea that the Spirit is on the root of Jesse and the Spirit is on the servant, this doesn't prove it's the same person. The Spirit of God is on all the prophets in the Bible, and even in Isaiah itself, it's not only on the root from Jesse. So Isaiah 44:3, for I will pour water on the thirsty land and streams on the dry ground. I will pour my Spirit upon your descendants and my blessing on your offspring. So this connection is very weak because the Spirit is not exclusive for the root of Jesse. It's a very common thing that the Spirit of God comes upon someone in the Bible. Another example of this is Isaiah 35. Until a Spirit from on high is poured out on us. So the Spirit is poured out on the people. So this is not at all a specific match with Isaiah 42. Similarly, Isaiah 61 itself, the author speaks there and he says, the Spirit is on me. So whoever is writing Isaiah 61 himself has the Spirit on him. And yes, I know that Christians will say Isaiah 61 is a prophecy about Jesus, but there's no need to do that. It very easily just reads as the speaker speaking about himself. So it would be talking about the prophet Isaiah himself, or whichever prophet spoke Isaiah 61. And again, if we go to Isaiah 48, it again there talks about Isaiah as having the Spirit. It says in verse 16, draw near to me. Hear this. From the beginning, I have not spoken in secret. From the time it came to be, I've been there. And now the Lord God has sent me and his Spirit. So again, in Isaiah himself has the Spirit. So this is a very loose connection.
Matthew again cites this passage directly, identifying Jesus' gentle ministry as the fulfillment of Isaiah's servant description, and Jesus inaugurates the new covenant in his blood.
Yeah, so this is just a very poor fulfillment of Isaiah 42. This whole idea that eating Jesus' flesh is the covenant in Isaiah 42, I'm sorry, this is very anachronistic, and the Jews didn't think like this. This is a very pagan idea, the idea of eating gods, and the idea that this is the fulfillment of Isaiah 42 is just very anachronistic.
Jesus inaugurates the new covenant in his blood. The servant's mission is to be a light to the nations. That's why Isaiah immediately calls distant peoples, including Kedar, to sing in response. The focus is global recognition of Israel's God. Jesus himself predicted that the gospel would be proclaimed throughout the world, and centuries before Muhammad even appeared, Christianity had already spread across the Roman world and beyond. By the time Islam showed
Another thing that refutes the idea that Christianity spreading to the Gentiles is the fulfillment of Isaiah 42 is that Jesus himself didn't actually come for the Gentiles. He said that I've only been sent for the lost sheep of Israel. And this idea that Jesus came for the Gentiles was a later development started by people like Paul. So the historical Jesus did not come for the Gentiles. This is something Christians innovated later on. And also the historical Jesus did not view himself as God. So he would not view the Christianity that spread amongst the Gentiles to be the fulfillment of his mission, because we know the historical Jesus didn't view himself as God, as is proven from many, many passages, such as Mark 10:18, which refutes the idea that Jesus is God. So the triune God version of Christianity that spread is not something that the historical Jesus himself believed or would have endorsed.
Islam showed up, communities of Christians were present in North Africa, Europe, Persia, and yes, even Arabia itself, a reality the Quran itself presupposes. That Arabian idolatry as some
The Christianity that spread across in the Gentile worlds is not the fulfillment of Isaiah 42. Again, the whole point of Isaiah 42 is that people stop worshiping their false gods and turn to the one God and begin worshiping him. The Christianity that spread to these different lands was this pagan Trinitarian Christianity where a man is God, where you have three gods. That is not at all the fulfillment of Isaiah 42. All Christianity did is replace people worshiping other humans and other idols and replace those gods with different gods. So instead of worshiping Zeus, people start worshiping Jesus. Instead of worshiping these idols, people start making idols of Mary and Jesus and start worshiping their saints. That is not at all a fulfillment of Isaiah 42. In contrast, when the Muslims came, they actually spread the knowledge of the one God to these different Gentiles, to these different nations.
through Jesus and his followers. Many of the nations had already given up their pagan practices to worship the God of Israel, all because of Jesus. Next up in Isaiah 49, the servant regathers Israel and becomes a light to the nations, yet he is despised by his own people. Isaiah 52.
So it's very weird that he's quoting Isaiah 49, because the whole point of Isaiah 49 is that the Israelites are in the lands of exile and they are brought back into the Holy Land. And we know, of course, that Jesus is actually the opposite of this. When Jesus came, the Israelites were already in the land. And as a punishment for rejecting Jesus, God punished the Israelites by destroying the temple and exiling the Jews. So whereas in Isaiah 49, the Israelites are in exile and are now coming back into the land, when Jesus came, the Israelites rejected him, and as a punishment, God sent the Romans to exile them out of the land. So Isaiah 49 is about them coming back into the land. Whereas after Jesus came, they were sent outside of the land. What's also strange about him quoting Isaiah 49 is if you go to the book of Acts, Paul, etc., actually quote Isaiah 49 and apply it to themselves. So from a Christian perspective, Isaiah 42 is applied to Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, yet in the book of Acts, the description of being a light to the Gentiles is quoted by Paul and the disciples and applied to themselves. So there are only two ways to reconcile this. Number one, only Isaiah 42 is about Jesus, whereas Isaiah 49 is about the righteous remnant. So in this case, Christians would be admitting that the servant of Isaiah 42 and the servant of Isaiah 49 are different. They're not the same servants. They are different servants. The servant of Isaiah 42 is Jesus, and the servant of Isaiah 49 is not Jesus specifically, but it is, for example, the righteous remnant. So it may include Jesus, but it's not limited to Jesus. So at this point, Christians would be conceding that 42 and 49 are not the same servant. The other way to reconcile it would be to say that Isaiah 42 itself is also about the remnant. And the reason that Matthew applies Isaiah 42 to Jesus is because Jesus is part of the remnant. And so both Isaiah 42 and 49 would not be about Jesus specifically, but be about the righteous remnant. And so that would include Jesus and Paul and all the Christians. So if you go with this reconciliation, you would be admitting that Isaiah 42 and 49 are not about the Davidic Messiah. And your whole attempt to link it to the Davidic Messiah found in Isaiah 11 would be destroyed. So basically, because in the Gospel of Matthew, Isaiah 42 is applied to Jesus, whereas the description of light to the Gentiles is applied to Paul, etc., in the book of Acts, there's no way around this except to say that either they're different servants, If you say they are different servants, then you yourself are conceding that Isaiah 42 is not necessarily the same servant that we find in Isaiah 49. It's not necessarily the same servant that we find in Isaiah 50, not necessarily the same servant we find in Isaiah 53. So then the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ wouldn't even have to fulfill those other texts. 42 itself would be enough if you were conceding that they are different servants. However, if you reconcile by saying Isaiah 42 isn't about Jesus specifically, but just the righteous remnant, then Isaiah 9 and 11 cannot be connected to Isaiah 42. So your whole previous argument is collapsed, because then Isaiah 42 and 49 would not be about a specific individual like we find in Isaiah 9 and 11, but rather would just be about a group of people. So either way, you would have to refute one of your arguments. Another thing is, if you reconcile by saying 42, 49, and all the servant songs are about a group of people, the righteous remnant, then you would be admitting that Isaiah 53, one of the servant songs, is about a group of people. And if it's about a group of people, a remnant of people, then it cannot be about Jesus being crucified.
Isaiah 52 and 53 depicts the servant growing up as a root out of dry ground, echoing that Davidic imagery once again. And he is despised and rejected, yet he bears the sins of the people and makes intercession for them. If the servant bears the sins of Israel, the servant can't be Israel. I know Muslims like Adnan try to adopt something like the Jewish national interpretation of Isaiah 53, but I've gone into detail elsewhere on why that reading doesn't work in another video. You can't say the servant is Muhammad in Isaiah 42 and then in another video. You can't say the servant is Muhammad in Isaiah 42 and then just set aside the rest of the servant songs. Finally,
so here, again, he seems to be making an argument that the identity of the servant is consistent throughout all the songs. They're all the same individual. Yet again, we just showed how this would put him into a massive problem, because the book of Acts applies the description of the light of the Gentiles, not to Jesus, but to Paul and the disciple. So again, either Christians have to concede that Isaiah 53, for example, is Jesus specifically one of the servant songs, but 49, one of the servant songs, is not Jesus specifically, but a group of people, in which case they would be admitting the servant is not necessarily the same individual in all the songs. Or else, alternatively, they will have to say that all the songs are about a group of people and Jesus is just one of those people, in which case Isaiah 53 cannot be about the crucifixion. Either way you spin it, Christians fall into a huge problem.
Finally, in Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is upon a figure to proclaim good news, liberty, and restoration. Again, just like we saw in Isaiah 11 and 42. According to Luke 4, Jesus explicitly reads this passage in the synagogue and declares that it is fulfilled in him, identifying himself directly with Isaiah's Spirit-anointed figure.
Isaiah 61, the author says, the Spirit is on me. So very naturally, it just reads as the prophet who's speaking in Isaiah 61 that we can say it's Isaiah saying that he is the one who is giving this good news, and he is the one upon whom is the Spirit, right? He literally says the Spirit is on me. So very naturally can be taken as the author himself speaking, not talking about a future figure arriving.
A Spirit-anointed Davidic servant represents Israel, restores the world, and is rejected by Israel, and bears the sin of the nation while bringing salvation to the world. Muhammad fits none of those things. The Muhammad argument only works by cherry-picking one poetic line in Isaiah 42, then cobbling together a few other weak connections, and ignoring the servant trajectory running across the entire book. If you find these videos...
Yeah, so again, the idea that the Spirit-anointed figure is the same figure throughout, that is just begging the question, because it's forcing the interpretation that Isaiah 61 is actually a prophecy about Jesus, whereas it just very naturally reads as Isaiah describing himself. And also, again, I mentioned that in Isaiah itself, the Spirit is not just on the figure of Isaiah 11, but it's on the people as well. It's on the descendants of Israel as well. And we know that the Spirit is on many, many people in the Bible. That is a very weak connection. The connection to Isaiah 11 is very poor as well. Again, Isaiah 40 begins a completely new section of the book, which pretty much the consensus of modern scholars is actually that it's a new author. It's a new author. And in fact, according to them, this new author is not actually interested in the idea of a Davidic Messiah. There is nowhere in Isaiah 40 onwards that clearly speaks about a root from David, a branch from David, a king coming from the line of David and restoring Israel. None of this is found in Isaiah 40 onwards. There is a lack of interest in this idea. In fact, as I mentioned, many scholars think that the Davidic figure here is actually Cyrus. He's given the roles of the Davidic Messiah. Again, he tried to say that all the servant songs are the same individual throughout, but I show that even the New Testament doesn't agree with this, because the New Testament says that Paul and the disciples are the light to the Gentile. So there's no way around this except to say that the servant in all the songs is not the same individual throughout, or to say that it is the same individual throughout, but that it is the remnant of Israel. It is a group, in which case Isaiah 53 cannot be about Jesus' crucifixion, and in which case Isaiah 42, etc., cannot be the single Davidic figure who's foretold in Isaiah 11. So the New Testament ends up destroying his arguments. And actually, another important point to mention here is that you can see here in his summary, in his conclusion, he's not given us a single verse in Isaiah 42 itself, which is a problem for the claim that Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam is the fulfillment of the prophecy. He hasn't given a single verse which does not fit the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. All he did is beg that, no, we must connect it to these different passages. And then he went to those different passages. But that's just interpretive. As for Isaiah 42 itself, you couldn't find a single issue with it. So implicitly, he's basically admitting that Isaiah 42 itself actually fits the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. And by the way, if Testify wants to connect all the servant songs and he wants to connect all of these passages, then it would end up refuting his interpretation, because Isaiah 40 onwards talks about an exile. Isaiah 49 talks about the Israelites coming out of exile and coming back into the land. And as I mentioned before, that is the opposite of Jesus, because after Jesus came, the Romans sent the Israelites into an exile instead of God saving them from an exile. However, when the Muslims came, the Israelites were actually finally allowed back into the land, and there were Israelites who came from their lands of exile and came back into the Holy Land. So your whole idea here of connecting all the songs and all the passages ends up slapping you right in the face.